Tom Osborne coached Nebraska for 25 years, giving us decades of consistency and dominance. Since his retirement in 1997, the program has slid into a state of disrepair, owing to some athletic department politics and some questionable hires. We've watched Nebraska slide into possibly its worst place since the 50s. Let's get into it. Hi, I'm Aaron Muller, and welcome to Cobsmacked. This is a channel dedicated to Husker football, the news, the stories, and the history. If you're a fan of Nebraska, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more content like this. The past 24 seasons at Nebraska have been a major downgrade from those glory days that we've seen from Bob Devaney all the way through Tom Osborne. And in this episode, we are going to cover 1998 to current day. If you haven't watched those previous three parts, you can go back. We've covered every Husker coach since 1890 all the way through Tom Osborne. And today we will get into Frank Solich through Scott Frost. So although I had heard of Bob Devaney, and I'm sure I've watched some of Tom Osborne's teams play, for reference, I was 6 when they won their last national championship in 1997. So I don't have so much connection with them, although they are a part of Husker football. You kind of like, when you grow up here, you just know these names, but I didn't watch them so much. So this period that we're going to be talking about today, Frank Solich, all these coaches that we're going to be talking about are more personal to me because I grew up watching the players and watching the coaches specifically. So we'll get right into Frank Solich. He was named Tom Osborne's successor after he retired in 1997. He was part of Bob Devaney's first recruiting class in 1962. So he's been in the program a long time. He had been a coach for Tom Osborne since 1979. He was actually the first Husker to rush for 200 yards when he was a player. He was an undersized fullback. I think he kind of made jokes about wearing chains and stuff under your sweatpants to try to weigh in at more, but he was still only like a $150. But he was inducted into the Nebraska Football Hall of Fame in 1992. So he'd been in the program a long time. He understood the tradition, he understood the culture, and he was here for all this success. So he knew what it took to be at the top and to stay there as well. So he came in, and right away he kind of just took off where Tom Osborne left off. So in 1999, they made it to the Big 12 title game, and they won over Texas, continuing with that strong option game as the offense. 2001, we made it to the national championship game with him, and we ended up losing to Miami in the Rose Bowl. This is the season that Eric Crouch won his Heisman. He became the third Heisman in Nebraska history. And I mean, as a kid, Eric Crouch was the guy. Like you remember this guy. You remember just how quick he was as a quarterback. You might not have even understood football, like fundamentals, but you knew he was a good player. And so you had Solich still kicking out these successful teams even after Osborne leaves, and you just didn't really feel like there was any drop off there. The next season in 2002, we would slip to 7-7, and it was the first non-winning season in over 40 years. It wasn't a losing season; it just was a not winning season. Frank Solich would go on to make aggressive changes to his defensive staff after this season, very similar to how Scott Frost is doing now, which we'll get into. But Solich made a big change on the defense because that was the area he thought needed the most work, and they made big changes, and it would pay off in 2003, where they would go 9-3 thanks to that newly refreshed defensive staff. So second-year athletic director Steve Peterson would proceed to fire Solich after that 9-3 season, right before the Alamo Bowl. He appointed Bo Pelini, who was the defensive coordinator that just got brought in, to be the interim head coach for that game. And he used the quotes, I mean, they're infamous now, but he did not want Nebraska to slide into mediocrity. He didn't want to surrender the Big 12 to Oklahoma and Texas. And, I mean, now those are infamous because we know how that played out. But Solich felt so betrayed by the fact that his home and his alma mater had turned their back on him, and that he was so upset by this that he did not return to Lincoln for 15 years after he was fired. So he was forced out of Nebraska after 6 winning seasons with a record of 58-19. Ironically, Solich had more wins in his first 6 seasons than Devaney or Osborne, and those are both Hall of Fame coaches. So the reasoning that Peterson gave didn't exactly fit, the reality of the situation, in which he was doing well. His first 6 seasons were very successful by all accounts. But politics and personal bias was really to blame there, and led to why Peterson made the decision that he did, and it would continue to haunt Nebraska for the next decade, 2 decades. How far away are we now? but it would come out later why. I say that the personal bias and the politics played into it, and it would come out later as the boosters started to talk about it, why he really fired Solich. And he had told the boosters that there was high-profile candidates that were showing interest in the program, and so he fired him before he even actually reached out to anybody. And so before he fired Solich, he didn't even hire a search firm, and even after he fired him, he decided to do all of the work himself. And he wanted Steve Spurrier specifically from the Redskins. He thought that he could go out to him, and Steve Spurrier would, jump on the opportunity to come coach at Nebraska. Didn't actually test that to see if that was a possibility, and Steve Spurrier turned him down. He tried to entice Urban Meyer away from Utah at the time, and Urban Meyer also turned him down. He ended up doing a 40-day coaching search, which 40 days is a long time to go without knowing who your head coach is going to be, especially for recruiting and things like that. You want to know who you're going to have coming in, and the players do as well. So it became disorganized and desperate because it was taking so long, and he didn't actually have anybody lined up. That coaches even began using Peterson's desperation in order to renegotiate their own contracts, because he would literally hire anybody that would take the job. So ultimately, Pelini would lead Nebraska to a bowl victory, and he and Turner Gill would both interview for that permanent coaching position as well, but they would both be passed over for former Raiders coach Bill Callahan. Getting into Bill Callahan, he was the coach he brought in. He got brought in 2004, and he was brought in to halt Nebraska's decline. What decline? I have no idea, but he was immediately met with backlash. He might be, and still might be, Nebraska's most disliked or hated coaches, and many fans still believe that Bill Callahan is the reason that Nebraska football is where it is. He ruined Nebraska football. He went against traditions. He didn't know how to win. He was arrogant. And although while doing some of this research, there's a lot of conflict between fan perception and fan reality. A lot of those things might have some truth to them, but it's not as bad as people were making it out to be as far as how his tenure goes. I think most of it had to do with the fact that because Frank Solich was let go in the way he was, a lot of fans felt like we abandoned a good, a beloved coach. And so Callahan, it didn't matter who they brought in after that. After the way that Frank Solich was let go, whoever got brought in was going to face this kind of backlash and this criticism. And so he wasn't given a fair shake in a lot of ways, which wasn't fair to him. But, he did some things as well that didn't really help his case. So one of the areas that fans can agree on is that Callahan could recruit guys. He didn't have time to cement a staff because, like I mentioned, that coaching search took 40 days. So it really cut into recruiting time. So in a lot of the other coaches that he wanted to bring in, they weren't available because it was too late in that offseason. So he brought in the guys that he thought he could recruit the best with, not necessarily that would work well together or his dream team, that type of thing. But he really wanted to focus on recruiting to plan for his overhaul. He brought in guys like Joe Gans, Prince Amukamara, Roy Helu, Niles Paul, and Ndamukong Suh. All these guys are more known for their time with Bo Pelini, which we'll get into, but all these guys were brought in by Callahan and his staff. So he needed all this talent to fuel his transition to this West Coast offense, which was mostly passing the ball. His biggest fan complaint was that he was going away from a successful option offense that had been working for literally decades, and that was the biggest criticism was for him, that he tried to bring this coastal offense to Nebraska and it just didn't work. But was it unsuccessful in reality? No. Tom Osborne even thought that it could work at Nebraska if he was able to get the talent here. One big issue that he ran into was that his NFL-sized playbook was really hard to digest by college players who hadn't seen concepts like this before. Now, in modern times, we'll see a lot more pro-style offenses in college. At the time, though, we didn't see that. And so a lot of these guys were having a hard time digesting this in one off season and just a few months before they actually had to start practicing with it. And there was a lot of times on the field where guys didn't know what they were actually supposed to be doing because there was so much going on. But if you look at his final year in Lincoln with Sam Keller and Joe Gans at quarterback, they put up 33.4 average points per game, 468 yards per game, with 323 of those being passing. In the final 3 games alone, they scored 163 points. However, they would only win one of those 3 matchups. So the biggest problem came from the defense. The defense was giving up 38 points per game, 476 yards per game, and this was a recurring issue throughout Callahan's time. He does have some valid criticisms kind of tying to that. He isolated himself from the fan base with his comments. As I mentioned, he hit that wall of backlash as soon as he came in, and his personality didn't help ease those tensions at all. So he came off as arrogant, which, I mean, there's a line between confidence and arrogance that is really hard to disseminate. A lot of people think Scott Frost is very arrogant as well. I think a lot of that is confidence. In Callahan's case, it did come off as arrogant. Like, I would explain it to you, but you wouldn't understand. Like, that doesn't come off well when you're talking to your fan base. He would admit later that he probably said some things that he shouldn't have said, and he kind of regretted it. But I think we're gonna talk about this with Bo Pelini as well. I think that there's so much pressure from the fan base to do well, especially Callahan coming in after you have Devaney, Tom Osborne, and Solich having successful seasons. You have a lot of pressure. It's like a pressure cooker in Nebraska, and he didn't deal with that so well, especially when he was struggling to win games. And Bo Pelini kind of dealt with the same thing. Even though Bo Pelini was winning, he wasn't winning enough in the fans' eyes. And so it's just a pressure cooker. A lot of guys react a lot of different ways, and he did not react wisely. He also failed to uphold much of the Husker culture and traditions that we kind of know as part of the program. And he downsized Nebraska's walk-on program, and I think that hurt. Even though he was bringing in these talented guys, I think kind of limiting the walk-on program's effect on the team limited the amount of talent that he could, develop. And I don't think that he thought of it that way, but I mean, that's the reality of the situation. Whenever we have had a strong walk-on program, we've also had a good team. So he downsized the walk-on program, and some of the former players would also go on to say that he really wanted to separate himself from the success of the 90s. He thought that was their time, and we need to figure out what our time is. We need to figure out how to be successful in our time. And so he would limit the former alumni coming in, the former players that had won championships and stuff. He had limited their access to the team, which, again, I don't know how much of that is true. It's former players kind of talking about Callahan, so you'd hope that it would be honest and truthful. But in any ways, I've heard from multiple sources that he kind of limited the access from the 90s as to try to build new traditions under him. And while that's not necessarily a bad mentality to go into, you don't want to hold on to the past so much that you're not looking forward to the future. But those are still parts of your history. Those are still guys that know what success looks like, and it's not a bad thing to ever hear from somebody who's successful. So his biggest failure, I think, though, as head coach was his inability to adjust. So as I mentioned, the defense struggled his whole time here, and he never fired the defensive coordinator, Kevin Cosgrove, because they were friends, because they had coached before they were buddies. So he never fired him, and that kind of led to his demise. Had he made a change sooner, there's an argument that he wins more games and he might still have been coaching at Nebraska. Very strong argument there. I think eventually he would have left for an NFL job, because that's kind of where he wanted to be. He wanted to be in the NFL. But I mean, there's an argument that had he had a defense that was able to keep teams under 30 points, that they would have been winning almost all their games. So it was actually so bad to the point that Ndamukong Suh was planning on transferring to Oregon State the same season that Bo Pelini got brought in, and both of the Pelini brothers convinced him to stay. They showed him, we are really good at defense, we will develop you, and he's very glad he stayed because of how things worked out. But just imagine Suh being probably the biggest character that Nebraska has had in the past 25 years, just not being here. He was here, but he wasn't the Suh that we know now under the Pelinis. They really developed him, and we'll get into that a little bit too. But he just struggled to recognize talent, and especially another example is he held Joe Gans back until Sam Keller got injured and he had to get taken out of the game. Joe Gans came in at that point, and Joe Gans would go on to hold a bunch of quarterback records for Nebraska. He was a very talented quarterback, and he would have worked well in his system, but he wasn't able to recognize that and identify that Joe Gans should have been the starter, even though he was producing better. And these are the things that are going to plague Callahan into his firing eventually. He would live and die by his game plans as well. His inability to adjust at halftime was a microcosm of his major inability to adjust anything. And even if it wasn't working, he'd just be stubborn, and he's like, this is the game plan, we're going to live or die by this. And he was 0-17 when trailing at halftime. there was no fixing a game if it was going down the toilet. And it wasn't just that he was losing games either, it was how he was losing. Blowouts were becoming a lot more commonplace. In that 2007 season alone, they had 5 games where they got beat by 18 or more points. I believe there was also like 4 games that season where they allowed opponents to score over 50 points. And it just you can't deal with that where you're not winning games, but then the games you're losing, you're also getting stomped. And obviously, that's never going to last. A head coach is never going to last under those conditions. But after suffering through a 5-game losing streak in 2007, that was the first 5-game losing streak since 1958, Steve Peterson was fired immediately, and Tom Osborne was brought in as an interim athletic director. He would later become the full-time athletic director, and the very next month, Callahan would lose to Kansas 76-39, which is the most points allowed by a Husker defense up to that point. And Callahan would be fired at the end of the season by Tom Osborne. Tom Osborne apparently had sat him down when he came in, and he said, if you can't, get a winning season, we're going to let you go. So he wasn't able to go. He didn't seem mad about it. He didn't it wasn't a surprise. He knew that it was coming. So although Callahan had brought in a high-powered offense, he was unable to manage a college football team. As I mentioned, he really kind of fit the NFL coaching mold, and he just wasn't unable to manage a roster, manage coaching staff, and certainly he was unable to let go of friends and put professional relationships in front of those personal ones. Tom Osborne would go on to hire the next head coach and return to these Husker roots and find more success there. Getting into Bo Pelini. So Bo Pelini would be named by Tom Osborne as the 32nd head coach of Nebraska beginning in 2008. He would get to work right away. He was actually hired over Turner Gill. Turner Gill once again applied for the head coaching job, and Bo Pelini was actually picked by Tom Osborne ahead of him, which, if you look back, Turner Gill was Tom Osborne's quarterback, so there had to be something that Bo Pelini brought to the table that Turner Gill just did not. Part of the reason he was passed over for this head coaching job in 2004 was his fiery personality, which he did carry on through his head coaching career. His fans would have a love-hate relationship with this attitude, this sideline antics, and many players responded to his energy and fire in a positive way. So, although some of it might have been fear, most of them would have gone to war for Bo Pelini. Will Compton on the podcast kind of talks about it quite a bit. Part of it was fear, but a lot of it was major respect and love for this guy who he personally did love these guys, and on a real man-to-man basis. Will Compton talked about how he would go down to the bar and make sure the guys weren't staying out late and drinking and stuff. He would go down to the bar, make sure if he hears you skipped class, they were afraid of that. So it was almost like a fatherly role that he played for a lot of these players, and they responded well to that. They would play their hearts out for this guy who would be willing to do anything for them. They would go 9-4 in his first season, and in 2009 they would establish themselves as a defensive powerhouse. 2 years after posting one of the worst scoring defenses in the nation, Nebraska would lead the country with 10.4 points per games allowed, behind Heisman finalist Ndamukong Suh. So we had mentioned that Suh was leaving. This season, Suh had an incredible year. If you go back and look at his stats this season, he was better than entire teams as far as his sacks and tackles, and he had an interception that he took back for a touchdown. It was just a magical year to watch Suh become a legendary figure at Nebraska. And it would all end with a controversial game to Texas, in which we had won the Big 12 championship, and they gave Texas a second back on the clock, and they ended up scoring with that final play. So it was controversial. Nebraska would end up going 10-4, and that gave Pelini, enough success in his first 2 seasons to get a raise and an extension. This was still with Tom Osborne as the AD. Nebraska would go on to join the Big Ten before the 2011 season, and they would play in the Big Ten championship in just their second year in the conference. Unfortunately, for those who remember, it was against Wisconsin, and Wisconsin absolutely stomped us. Melvin Gordon set a single-game record at the time, 408 rushing yards and 4 touchdowns in that championship game, and Wisconsin would be a major thorn on our side, still kind of are, just how well they run against Nebraska, and especially Bo Pelini. They had this really, really good defense, but they were never able to stop Wisconsin. The big-time meltdowns and the subsequent sideline explosions would plague Pelini in his tenure here, and I understand the passion. and I said this when he was coach, like, I liked the passion. I liked the fact that he would get in a referee's ear if a call was missed and it was blatant, or if if his players screwed up, he was more up there than the referees. But you could argue now that has hurt us since he's left, because the referees dealt with that for so long that they kind of held it against us, which, I mean, that's kind of a conspiracy theory, but there was a long period where we didn't get held for calling. Like, no teams got held for holding calls against Nebraska, and it just seemed more than a coincidence that happened that way. Regardless, he would bring these passionate, like, explosions to the sideline, which would help in some cases, but there was also situations in which case it hurt the team. It hurt, if a guy messed up, he knew he messed up. He didn't need to know that he didn't need to get his face ripped off when he got to the sideline. But ultimately, these blowout losses and big games would end an otherwise successful tenure for Bo Pelini. Following another 9-win season in 2014, personal bias would once again strike from the athletic department chair, and Sean Eichhorst, the new athletic director, would fire Bo Pelini before the Holiday Bowl. He would cite his failure in his important games, in these big games, and his pattern of unprofessional behavior. Barney Cotton would go on to coach the bowl game, losing to USC. But Pelini would have led Nebraska to 7 consecutive seasons, and he never won less than 9 games. He made it to a bowl game every season. They went 3-3, but bowl game every season, it was almost a guarantee with him. And although it was not on the same level as Solich and the betrayal that Frank Solich dealt with, many fans felt that the athletic department had betrayed another good coach. And I remember personally, like, talking to people, a lot of fans were upset that Bo Pelini got fired because he was winning for us. He wasn't winning big games, but we were winning. And they were fun to watch. Taylor Martinez was fun to watch. Levante David and Ndamukong Suh were fun to watch. The defenses were amazing. And a lot of fans were upset that was gone now, and it was kind of gone suddenly. We didn't see it coming. But others were kind of in wait-and-see mode. These were the people that didn't really like Bo Pelini's, like, fiery antics and things like that. And so they were in wait-and-see mode. They wanted to see, maybe he'll bring in somebody good. Maybe this will be a step up and we'll be able to actually overcome those big games. That would not last. 4 days after firing Bo Pelini, Mike Riley would be named the next head coach, despite very high criticism from nearly everybody. So looking at Mike Riley, he would come in 2015. The 61-year-old head coach of Oregon State would be brought in to replace Bo Pelini, and Eichhorst would state that Riley met all of the characteristics that he was looking for the next head coach at Nebraska. He had a proven track record of success, he had a sound approach to football and education, and he had a good level of integrity. Riley had coached for 14 seasons at Oregon State. There was a 3-year stint in the NFL mixed in there, but for the most part, he was at Oregon State. He went 93-80 at Oregon State, but over the prior 5 seasons before coming to Lincoln, he was averaging just 5 wins a season. So one of Pelini's biggest criticisms was these big games that he was dropping, and Riley seemed to be able to snipe top 10 teams like once a season. But outside of that, it wasn't a great record. Riley was 4-21 against top 10 teams. He was 14-41 against top 25 teams. And although he could snipe those top teams occasionally, he just wasn't consistent. He more often than not lost those games. And that's with arguably weaker schedule, given that he was at Oregon State. But he was brought in, and he kind of brought in this Calibraska mentality with him. He kind of said, if I can bring these coastal talents, Bill Callahan had the same mentality almost. Bring the coastal talent to Nebraska, and you can have a different offense and a faster offense. And he thought bringing in this coastal talent would overwhelm opponents in the Big Ten. Many fans would immediately question the hire and Riley's lack of success, especially recently prior to Nebraska. Although Mike Riley's integrity would never be brought into question, that was one thing that Eichhorst nailed on the head. His integrity was great. A lot of people call him Grandpa, like almost sarcastically, but the fear surrounding his track record would soon be realized. So in 2015, they would go 6-7. It would have been 5-7, and they would have missed a bowl game, but due to a lack of eligible teams, the Foster Farms Bowl gave an invite to Nebraska because of our academic standing. This was the season in general was highlighted by a controversial late touchdown win over number 6 Michigan State, where Riley went out, not Riley the coach, one of the players, Riley, went out of bounds, came back in, caught a touchdown pass. It was ruled that he was forced out of bounds, so he was able to return back into the field of play, but still controversial. Referees said that it was good to go, which, God, win some, lose some. But we won that game 39-38, and that would probably be the last big win that Nebraska has had. Awesome. But that derailed Michigan State's college football playoff chances that year. It was the first year for the college football playoff, I believe, and Michigan State was primed and ready to go be in that category, and we knocked them off of that. 2016, we started off 7-0, so it looked like everything was turned around. We were on the high road, and Riley might actually work out. We reached as high as number 8 in the rankings, number 5 in some polls. We dropped the next two to Wisconsin and Ohio State, though, and we ended the season 9-4. Still a respectable season. Successful season behind the likes of Tommy Armstrong, Stanley Morgan Jr., and Jordan Westerkamp. This Nebraska recruiting really started to pick up this season as well, with guys like Lamar Jackson and Markel Dismuke committing to Nebraska. Many fans believed that this 2016 success and the recruiting path and the guys that were coming in was going to set up 2017 to be a big contender for the Big Ten West, and it's just not exactly how things played out. 2017 would roll around, and Nebraska would have 3 non-conference games to start the season. We would win the season opener against Arkansas State, then we would go to Eugene and lose to Oregon, and then we would suffer a devastating home loss to Northern Illinois, and that would foreshadow what was to come in the season. We would finish the last 9 games going 3-6, being outscored by opponents 214-338 over that time. 4 times in the 2017 season, we allowed opponents to score 54 or more points on us, and the 4 games that we did win, we won against Arkansas State, Illinois, Rutgers, and Purdue. So even the games we were able to pull off, they were still close. We still had to struggle to beat these bad teams, but they weren't quality wins. They weren't good teams. And we capped off the season with a 14-56 home loss to Iowa. Riley would go 0-3 against Iowa during his time, being outscored by them 44-124 in those 3 matchups. So not only was he unable to beat Iowa, which in my mind is the biggest rival that Nebraska has currently in the Big Ten, and part of that's because we're neighbors. Part of that is because I don't like Iowa because I lived there for a bit, and I just don't like Hawkeye fans. But regardless, we weren't just getting beat by Iowa. We were getting smashed by Iowa every time we played. And this 2017 season really took a turn. 2016, we started off 7-0. People thought that the 2017 season was going to be the season we finally got things to click and turn around. However, we came out and every single game looked uncompetitive. It looked like we didn't want to be on the field, and it looked like the players were just giving up. We would play against teams. Michigan would come out and say it didn't look like they wanted to be out there. And you don't want your opponents to come out and say that Nebraska doesn't want to even be playing football. That's not what you want to hear. The athletic director, Sean Icorst, would be fired following that shocking loss to Northern Illinois. His replacement, Bill Moose, would come in and immediately release Riley the day after that Iowa game. Soon after, he would bring in one of the most sought-after coaches in the nation, in Scott Frost. So Scott Frost would start in 2018, and he remains one of the most polarizing figures in Husker history, at least recently. Some feel that he should have gotten the axe after going 3-9 and 1-8 in the conference last season. His total record so far at Nebraska has been 15-31, while going 0-14 against ranked opponents. He has had 4 consecutive losing seasons since, which is the worst since Bill Jennings from 57-61. And others feel that we have slid so far that it was going to take a significant amount of time for anybody to get it turned around. So when Scott Frost got brought in, he was given a 5-year contract, or even a 7-year contract, I'm not sure. But either way, a 5-year minimum contract. And a lot of people were like, he hasn't proven anything yet, so why is he getting such a long runway? And I think that's because Scott Frost, the administration, everybody knew that we had slid further than most people thought. So it was going to take a significant amount of time to get things turned around. But even for those supporters, year 4 should have shown signs of improvement already. Last season should have shown signs of improvement. And it just didn't appear that way, although I think that there's more to it than what we've seen as fans. You have to dig a little deeper. But regardless of how we feel now, at the time he was brought in, he was one of the hottest coaches in college football. And he took over a 0-12 UCF team, and within 2 years, he brought them to an undefeated season in which they claim a national championship. But UCF is a smaller school. They have more local talent in Florida, and it's an easier schedule being a smaller school. But still, most fans thought that he would be able to bring that magic from UCF and have a quick turnaround at Nebraska. Apparently, when Scott Frost arrived in Lincoln, things were worse than he thought as far as culture and mentality goes. And he originally didn't even want to come. He wasn't sure if he wanted to come take this job at Nebraska. He was going to be offered a job at Florida as well, among other schools. But Tom Osborne had to sit down and talk with him and convince him, come home, fix things, make things right, come back to your alma mater, which Frost wanted to. It's just that things had fallen apart so much that he didn't know if he was going to be able to rebuild it. He was still confident that he would be able to bring in his Oregon offense once he did arrive and find success in Nebraska. However, under Riley, some things had slid that I didn't think he expected, such as guys weren't required to show up to strength training. The nutrition program had kind of fallen off. Just a lot of the player accountability was kind of just thrown out the window. He said one of the things, just as a small thing that most people kind of overlook, he said that one of the first plane trips they took as a team, when they got off the train, it was littered with garbage. Like there was just garbage all over the floor. And he made them go back and clean it up. He said that you need to find respect for yourself. Like it's just a little thing like that. Like the players under Tom Osborne respected like everything they were given. They respected it. And players with Riley, he kind of just let things slide, and that's just not going to. Little things add up to bigger things when you get to game day. So little things like that he would say during press conferences really caught me, and said that things had slid on a micro level, and it was affecting the macro team. So his return to Lincoln would be plagued with unfortunate circumstances as well from the very beginning. So 2018, there was a ton of hype and excitement going into this season, and people thought, Frost is coming in. He's the golden child. He's a national championship quarterback, and he's going to get things turned around. And there obviously was a lot of talk going into the season as well about how Frost is going to make the Big Ten change for him and that kind of thing. And it came off as cocky, but he was confident. He honestly believed that it was going to be, just more football being played. There wasn't going to be so much a rebuild, and that wasn't the case at all. His first game against Akron, in which case we were supposed to showcase, all of the changes he had made the offseason, a freak lightning storm came into Lincoln, and we had to cancel the game. It seemingly sucked the wind from Nebraska's sails, because we would drop the first 6 games of that season after that, which is the worst start in school history. However, we would rebound in the second half of the season, going 4-2 to finish 4-8 overall, including a competitive game against a top 10 Ohio State. This game made a lot of people feel like even though we were struggling, the little things were starting to get corrected, and it would add up, and we would be able to compete very soon. Playing Iowa close was another good thing. We lost to Iowa by a field goal to seal the win. It was no longer a blowout like we had experienced every year with Riley, and it was a field goal to win the game. So for Iowa, as bad as the first half of the season was, there was a ton of hope and optimism as to how it ended and how we were able to compete with everybody. And just the little things need to be changed. Like our size, one of the comments came out when Scott Frost, we played Iowa. He said that he looked across the field and seen that Iowa was just bigger and stronger than we were, and he never thought he would see that. And so it wasn't something that he didn't know how to address, and we had a lot of optimism that he'd be able to go forward with that. Adrian Martinez this season emerged as an electric athletic quarterback. He won Freshman of the Week awards 3 times in the final 6 games. Divino Zigbo went for over 1,000 yards rushing for the first time since Amir Abdullah, and Stanley Morgan Jr. became Nebraska's first 1,000-yard receiver. This allowed the fan base to have high expectations and high hopes for Frost's second year. Getting into that second year, 2019 would start off with another season of off-season hype, and it was only fueled when the Huskers were picked to win the Big Ten West by some, calculations. Many Riley recruits would hit the transfer portal in 2019, and despite this, we would win the season opener against South Alabama. We would then lose a heartbreaker in overtime in Boulder against Colorado, and it seemed like the Huskers were primed to win this game. We were ahead in this game, and Colorado made a comeback and ended up tying the game and then beating us in overtime. So we just collapsed in that game, and again, it was one of those moments where the wind got sucked out of our sails, and we didn't really recover from that. The season seemed to follow suit. We would head into a college game day matchup against number 5 Ohio State with a 3-1 record, and we would get absolutely smashed as they would beat us 7-48. And the gap in talent against Ohio State was undeniable. The previous season we had played them, and it was competitive, and for whatever reason this season the talent just we had no chance in that game. 2-5 after this beatdown in the season. We capped off the season with another Iowa field goal to seal a victory, and they left Lincoln with the win. We finished the season going 5-7, and the only real silver lining this season was that aside from that Ohio State beatdown and a Minnesota game in which they went crazy on us, every game was close and competitive again. And so the narrative was that Nebraska was closing that gap and that we would get there and we were going to turn the corner and that next season would be the season. So 2020 would come about, and unfortunately for Scott Frost, he would deal with another gut punch to his rebuild, nearly ruining the entire 2020 season. So the COVID pandemic would sweep across the world, and the Big Ten originally planned on canceling the season completely, but backlash from the fans, from media, from players, from parents, led to petitions spearheaded by Nebraska, later by Ohio State, and that led to a late season from the Big Ten. But we would only play 9 conference games, no non-conference. And COVID aside, Nebraska dealt with a mass exodus of players once again. 32 players would exit the program, 3 of them being dismissed, including Maurice Washington, who was one of the top wide receivers on the team. Many fans speculated about internal issues and why a lot of these guys were leaving, and causing a lot of these top players to go. And coaching staff would come out and talk about how there was bad culture in the locker room and kind of how the expectation was down here when Frost came in. Now he's raised it back to where it should be, and a lot of players aren't willing to work and get up to that level. So a lot of the guys that aren't willing to put in the effort are going to go, and it's not really a loss for the team. I do think it's important to remember, too, that watching these games and listening to these games on the radio, you're dealing with mostly empty stadiums. There might have been parents and 1,000 people in the stadium, but there's supposed to be 90,000. So there's not energy there. You can hear the clashing of the pads. You can hear the players and the coaches yelling at each other. And the players would say that atmosphere didn't impact their performance on the field, but I'm not sure how it couldn't, because they talk about the energy in the stadium and the motivation and the momentum that the stadium provides. How can that not affect you when all of that's gone? It almost felt like you were watching or listening to a team practicing, and I felt like watching it, that's how they came out and played a lot of times, is that this isn't a game, this is still a practice, because there's no energy here. And it's just kind of how the season went. I just thought it was such an eerie thing. Aside from that season opener against number 5 Ohio State, who we lost 17-52, every other game was close. But ultimately, the season would play out the same way. We'd have a lot of close games. We weren't able to get over the hump, though, and so we would drop a lot of them. The highly anticipated game against Wisconsin was canceled due to COVID. It was the only game that we had canceled that season, so we would only play 8 games, but we would go 3-5, and another weird and disappointing season. 2021 would roll around, and people didn't really know what to expect from this season. We knew that there had to be some marks of success here, some marks of improvement. Scott Frost really felt pressure, I'm sure, going into the season and partway through the season as well. But it was such a crazy year overall, still trying to get over the COVID stuff, still working out some new things. But it was such a crazy season that I did a full review episode on it, which you can check out. I'll link in the screen here. But there's a lot to get through. It almost deserves its own episode, which I have. So many consider this a make-or-break year for Scott Frost, and if Scott Frost wasn't able to make a bowl game, many people were ready to move on. And unfortunately for him, 2 major shifts in college football would occur before the season started. So the new one-time transfer portal rule would happen, and the name, image, and likeness thing would be ruled by the Supreme Court as well, letting players get paid from outside sources. So 27 players left the program going through that new transfer portal rule, including Wan'Dale Robinson, who was the top offensive performer on the team. That's the third year in a row that Nebraska has lost a top wide receiver or a top offensive player in general. On top of that, Nebraska would play the second hardest schedule in the country, not just in the Big Ten, but in the entire country. By the end of the season, we would play 5 teams that were in the top 5 at some point or another, and those 5 teams would also end with 10 or more wins. So despite all of these changes, despite all of the obstacles placed in front of them, the players and the coaches were determined to see success. While every game was competitive again, that's kind of been pretty consistent through Scott Frost's career. Nebraska did have opportunities to win these games. It just dealt with too much to overcome. A struggling offense stemming from downright bad offensive line play, arguably the worst special teams performances that Nebraska has seen in its program, and a string of injuries would all ensure that Nebraska would hit the record books. The Cornhuskers would go 3-9, losing all 9 by single digits. That was a NCAA record, losing 9 games by single digits. And although some people call it the greatest 3-9 team of all time, it was a long and torturous season for Husker faithful. It was hard to watch games that you could have just as easily won as losing, and we lost all of them. Like, every game that you had a chance to win, and in many cases you were winning the game, you should have won the game. I can't remember how many times I looked through the probability stats, and we were like 94% probability to win or 98.7 probability to win, and you just let it slip away. We found ways actively to lose the games, and it was hard to watch, but you just couldn't stop watching because you always felt like there was a chance you were going to win. You never went into a game thinking we're going to get blown out. Never happened. For something to happen and for victory to slip away is just a constant, stab every week. And it was almost the opposite of the Sooner magic that we talked about in part 3, where the Sooners always seemed to find a way to pull out a win. Nebraska always seemed to find a way to lose the game. And, it happened from the beginning to the end. We dropped the season opener against Illinois, in which the special teams debacle, muffed punt, set the tone of the game, foreshadowed the season to come. Although we did play number 3 Oklahoma in Norman extremely well, losing by 7. So there was this game. Many people thought we would go into this game, probably get stomped because Oklahoma had been a very highly efficient and successful team. We only lost by 7 to them, and it was fairly close. We missed field goals in that game that might have made the difference there. We followed that up by losing in overtime to Michigan State. This was a game, again, in which the special teams cost the game. We had all but won it. In the fourth quarter, we had 94% chance to win that game, and a blown punt that was taken back for a touchdown blew the game for us. Then Nebraska would fire on all cylinders the week after that and beat down Northwestern 56-7. This was the best game I have watched in a very long time. It just seemed like everything worked how it was supposed to, and everybody did their job. And so we thought maybe we've turned the corner. This was the turn the corner moment. It didn't turn out to be that way. Nebraska would lose the last 6 games by an average of 6 points, collapsing with late leads in many of those games. Against eventual college football playoff team Michigan, we lost when we fumbled it late and allowed them to get a chip shot field goal. We had another heartbreaker against Iowa. We had a 21-9 lead going into the fourth quarter, and we somehow managed to squander that away. Statistically, the season results make no sense. So there was a 0-point differential in conference opponents, which should mean roughly 50% win rate, but we only won 1 of those games. Heading into the Iowa game, 3-8 Nebraska was actually favored over the 9-2 Iowa team, which is the first time since records have been starting to be kept that has happened, that a team that has a bad record like that is favored over a team that has only lost 2 games. And it was because Nebraska played every game close enough to win it, and it didn't matter. Nebraska's offense was ranked 37th in the country, and our defense was ranked 16th, although the special teams really brought that down. So if you exclude special teams completely, the predictions and the calculations and stuff predicted that Nebraska would win 9 wins and have 3 losses and be ranked 23rd. I think more incredibly, if you take the 9 single-digit losses and you look at the highest win probability point during that game for Nebraska, you are more likely to get hit by lightning and win the lottery than to lose all of those games. That's incredible. like a lot of people were making jokes that we live in a simulation, because we had a good team and a bad team at the same time. The chances of you losing all of those games in the manner that you lost them, some games you had a big lead and you blew it. Some games were close. Some games had a fumble that bounced the wrong way. Some games had a kick return to end the game. We had a different way to lose every week. The chances that all of those happen in the same season is, obviously very hard to accomplish. So overall, you'd expect that a coach at Nebraska that has 4 consecutive losing seasons would be let go, would be fired. But because of the fight that the team displayed all season, even after we missed the point where we weren't going to go to a bowl game, the team didn't give up and quit. We didn't get blown out every game after that. We still fought and we pushed in every single game. And Frost was given another chance. He was said to be extended through the 2022 season, and they restructured his contract, though. He did decrease his buyout, and he does have a undetermined, set of criteria that he has to meet next season in order to keep his job, which there's been speculation. The contract technically ends 6 games into the season. So if he doesn't, I'm assuming, show progress in the first 6 games, I'm guessing he is gone. But regardless, they restructured his contract, which him taking a decreased buyout for himself is showing that he's betting on himself. Part of this led to a total offensive overhaul except for tight ends coach Sean Beckton. He fired every other offensive coach and brought in some pretty notable names to fill in those spots. So this new coaching staff, coupled with an aggressive transfer portal, search, has led to a lot of offseason hype, maybe the most offseason hype that I can remember since I've been watching. And this is because we're so freaking close and we need to get over the hump. And once we get the ball rolling, a lot of people feel like it's going to stay that way. So next season's schedule promises to be the least challenging in Frost's tenure so far. It's been a long time since Nebraska had a less challenging schedule. But we finally have one, and with all of the things adding up, it seems like next season, you'll see a consistent thing as we've been going back through the coaching history. Every season, we have a bad season. The next season's going to be the season. So the hopes are high that Nebraska will finally start seeing success, and a lot of us are just in wait-and-see mode. So during its long history, the Cornhuskers have produced some of the most dominant teams the sport has ever seen. In other years, we have landed in the record books for more depressing reasons. But next season, Scott Frost will trot out Nebraska's 133rd football team. We will hope that they will be able to regain that tradition of winning and that magic of Husker football. But one thing is for certain. The state's dedication to college football is unlike anywhere else in the nation. With a long history of legendary coaches, of players, a proud program full of traditions and culture, and the best fans in college football, there really is no place like Nebraska. But that's going to wrap up these final parts to this Husker history series where we looked back at all of the Husker coaches since the program's inception. Hopefully you found it as interesting as I did, and it helps you appreciate the program a little bit more. But until next time, go Big Red.